Hello. If you are new to the channel, welcome. I post scary stories on a daily basis. Your support would mean the world to me. So, if you enjoy listening to scary stories, please subscribe. Today, I have 4 true scary stories about people who seemed innocent at first, but had dark motives hidden beneath their smiles. And now, let's begin. I never planned to be involved in anything like this. At the time, I was just living my life, trying to figure out how to make ends meet, and focusing on work. But that was before he found me, before everything changed. I'm 32, and for the past 5 years, I've been running a small business here in Miami. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills and keeps me busy. I specialize in landscaping, mostly residential. I've built a decent reputation, nothing special, but it works. I like the physicality of it, the satisfaction of seeing a project through. Most of my clients are older, retired, some wealthy, and some just struggling to maintain their homes. I try to keep it professional, work hard, and stay under the radar. Nothing fancy. No big dreams of scaling up. I'm fine with my life, just as it is. It's not the most exciting career, but I'm content. I remember the first time I saw him. It was late morning, and I was on the job, trimming a hedge in the front yard of one of my regular clients. Mrs. Perez had asked me to trim it back a bit because her husband had passed away, and she could never keep up with the yard work herself anymore. She was a sweet woman, always offering me lemonade or coffee when I came over. I had just finished cutting back the last bit of hedge when I saw him. He was walking down the sidewalk toward me, a man I had never seen before. He had dark, slightly disheveled hair, a well-tailored but outdated suit, and a smile that seemed practiced. "Hey there," he called out as he approached, his voice cheerful and insistent. "You're the guy who works on the lawns around here, right?" I wiped the sweat from my brow, trying to size him up. He didn't look like a regular neighborhood guy, and his attire seemed out of place in the middle of a quiet street on a Tuesday morning. "I do landscaping, yeah," I said, trying to keep the conversation short. I wasn't in the mood for anything beyond the usual small talk with Mrs. Perez or her neighbors. "I'm James," he said, extending a hand. "I noticed your work here, really clean, sharp edges, right angles, precise. You know, there's money in this business, lots of it. Have you ever thought about expanding?" I shook his hand, but my mind was already drifting. I wasn't interested in making my business bigger. It was hard enough keeping up with the demands I had already, but I gave him a polite smile, hoping he'd move on. "I appreciate the compliment, but I'm good," I said, stepping back to grab my tools. He didn't take the hint. "You know, I've got an opportunity, an investment. It could make you a lot of money. What if I told you there's a way to grow your business with almost no effort on your part?" I glanced over at Mrs. Perez's house. She was inside, no doubt watching TV, oblivious to this conversation. "Thanks, but I'm happy where I'm at. Really." He didn't back down. "It's not just about landscaping. It's a whole system, a way to generate passive income while you focus on your work. You know, build something for the future, right? I've got some connections, and I've been seeing real returns. Why not hear me out? I promise you won't regret it." His words hung in the air, pressing against me like a weight. I could tell by the way he spoke so confident, so sure of himself, that this wasn't just an offhand conversation. This was calculated. He had a plan, a pitch, a strategy to reel me in. I finally put my tools down, tired of the back and forth. Listen, I'm not interested, all right? I've got my own thing going on. Don't need to be involved in some get-rich-quick scheme. His face hardened for a split second, but then, like flipping a switch, he smiled again. No problem, man. No harm in asking. I'll let you get back to work. Have a good day. I watched him walk off, still smiling, but something about the way he left didn't sit right with me. I shrugged it off and got back to work. But it wasn't the last time I saw him. Over the next few days, James kept showing up. He wasn't even subtle about it. Every morning, he would walk by while I worked, and I could see him hanging around, waiting for a chance to speak to me again. It started to feel a little more like stalking than salesmanship. I ignored him at first, keeping my head down, but he didn't take the hint. "Hey, man, I was thinking about what you said," he started one morning, his voice too loud for comfort. "I get it. You're not looking to change everything overnight. But what if I told you there's a way to make your business even more secure, more reliable? I know some folks who've made a killing with this system." I set my shears down and turned to face him. "I told you already, I'm not interested. Please stop coming around." But he didn't listen. He pushed harder. "You've got the work ethic, I can see that. But that's just one part of the puzzle. You need the right connections, the right people. I'm offering you something you can't get anywhere else. Why wouldn't you at least take a look?" It was starting to get creepy. He wouldn't leave me alone. The next day, I was finishing up a job at another client's house when he showed up again, this time with a brochure in his hands. I could feel the blood start to drain from my face. I didn't want to deal with him, didn't want him around. But there he was again, all smiles and promises. I snapped. I said no, all right? Just leave me the hell alone. James's smile faltered for a second, but it didn't disappear. His eyes narrowed. "You don't know what you're turning down, buddy." He stormed off, and for the first time, I felt like I had made him mad, really mad. But I figured that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next evening, I finished my last job for the day and was heading home. It was dark, the streets lit only by the yellow glow of streetlights. I was tired, my back sore from bending and kneeling all day. I turned the corner near my apartment when I saw James again. This time, he wasn't just hanging out. He was standing in the shadows, as if waiting for me. I stopped in my tracks. "What the hell do you want?" He stepped into the light, grinning like nothing had happened. "Hey, I've been thinking about our conversation. I don't want you to miss out on something that could change your life. Why don't we just go grab a coffee, talk it over? No pressure." I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Something was wrong. I didn't want to go anywhere with him. I backed up, ready to turn and run, when he suddenly lunged forward, grabbing my arm. "You're not going anywhere," he hissed, his voice low and threatening. I yanked my arm back and tried to push him away, but he was stronger than I expected. He had some kind of freakish grip on me, and I could see it in his eyes. He was beyond rationality now. This wasn't about a business deal. This was about something darker, something far more sinister. In a panic, I swung my elbow hard into his ribs. It wasn't much, but it was enough to break his hold for a second. I bolted, running as fast as I could down the street. I didn't look back, just pushed myself forward. My heart pounded in my chest, my legs burning with the effort. But I kept going, praying I could outrun him. By some miracle, I made it to a well-lit part of the street where a couple of people were standing outside a bar. I stopped to catch my breath, watching for any sign of him. When I was sure he wasn't following, I pulled out my phone and dialed the police. The next few days were a blur. I was shaken, paranoid, unable to sleep. But when the cops finally caught up with James, they found something chilling. It wasn't just his failed investment scheme. He had a record, a long one. And they had enough evidence to show he'd been trying to lure in other people the same way he had with me. They arrested him, and as far as I know, he's still in jail. No one knows what he truly wanted, but I'm sure it wasn't just money. I moved shortly after that, but the memory still haunts me. James is gone, but I still look over my shoulder sometimes, wondering if I was the lucky one, or if he's still out there, waiting to make his next move. I didn't expect anything strange to happen when I moved to this little coastal town. I was looking for a fresh start. At 30, I'd already dealt with more than my fair share of personal struggles, so when a friend told me about a small job opening here, I figured it was a perfect opportunity to begin again. It wasn't glamorous work, just managing a small local bookstore, but it was quiet, and I figured the peaceful, slow pace of the town would help me reset. The bookstore was tucked away on a corner just off the main street. It had that charming, worn-down look to it, with old wooden shelves that creaked when you touched them, and the faint smell of sea salt mixed with old paper. It was exactly what I'd imagined when I thought about finding a cozy, offbeat place to work. The owner, an older woman named Margaret, was sweet and welcoming, and she introduced me to the regulars, all of whom were quiet and respectful. It felt like the kind of place where nothing bad could happen. I was wrong, of course. It started with him, the man who would come into the store almost every day. His name was Vincent, though I didn't know that at first. He was unremarkable in every way, mid-40s, with unkempt brown hair, a tired expression, and old jeans that were frayed at the edges. He didn't look like someone who would stand out, but something about him always made me uncomfortable. He had a way of staring at things for far too long, lingering in a spot as though he didn't know where to move next. I chalked it up to shyness, figuring he was just a bit of a loner. For the first few weeks, I didn't think much of it. He would come in, browse the shelves, and sometimes make small talk. I'd greet him, offer recommendations, but he rarely said more than a sentence or two. It was always polite, though a little forced. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then, one day, he started talking more. "Have you ever read The Sea's Whisper?" he asked, his voice low but direct, like he expected me to know exactly what he was referring to. I shook my head, surprised by the sudden interest. "No, can't say I have. What's it about?" "It's a story about a town, much like this one," he said, eyes narrowing. "But it's about a town that's hiding a secret, The kind of secret that keeps you up at night. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just nodded. Sounds interesting. I'll keep an eye out for it. He looked pleased by my answer, though I could tell something had shifted. His posture had changed, a little more rigid, almost like he was waiting for me to say something else. But I didn't. I let the conversation die there, and he left the store quietly, the bell above the door jingling as he stepped out. The next time he came in, it wasn't for a book. He stood in front of the counter, leaning over it, his hands clasped together as though he was trying to keep them still. "I've been thinking about you," he said, his voice suddenly more serious than I'd ever heard it. "I think you're the right person. I think you'll understand." "Understand what?" I asked, nervous now. My stomach churned, and I shifted uncomfortably behind the counter. This wasn't the friendly, harmless man I'd first encountered. "The secret, of course," he said, eyes darkening. "You'd be surprised what people hide in a small town like this. But it's not really about the town, is it? It's about the people. You know, the ones who think they're safe. I can show you the truth." I was silent for a long moment, unsure how to respond. My gut was telling me to walk away, that I needed to tell Margaret about his increasingly odd behavior, but instead, I just nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm not sure what you mean, Vincent, but—" "It's okay," he interrupted, his smile now wide, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'll show you. You'll see soon enough." He turned and left, just like that. It was as if the conversation had never happened. The next few days were strange. Vincent didn't show up at the store for a couple of days, which was unusual considering how regular he'd been. But when he did return, something was different about him. He had a new energy, like he'd found a purpose, and his eyes were gleaming with a kind of feverish excitement. He made a beeline for me at the counter, his footsteps deliberate. "I've got it," he said, practically whispering. "I've figured it out. You're the one who can help me, and I know you will." I backed away slightly, my instincts screaming at me to leave the store, to get out of there. "Help you with what?" He smiled, but it wasn't the same smile he used to give me. This one was dark, almost predatory. "There's someone you should meet, someone who knows, who can guide you to the truth." I didn't know what he meant, but my discomfort had reached its peak. I felt trapped in the store with this man, and I could tell by the way he was looking at me that he wasn't going to just leave. "I think you need to go now," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "You're making me uncomfortable, Vincent." His expression shifted, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "You don't understand yet, do you? The truth isn't something you can run from. It finds you, whether you want it to or not." Before I could respond, the door jingled, and Margaret walked in from the back room, breaking the tension. Vincent turned to her, his demeanor immediately softening. "Ah, Margaret," he said, his voice turning sweet again. "I was just telling your assistant here that there's a lot more to this town than meets the eye. But I'm sure you already know that." Margaret gave a quick smile, but didn't engage. "Can I help you, Vincent?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I think I'll be back later. But remember, I'll be waiting." As he left, The weight of his words pressed down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I spent the rest of the day on edge, watching the clock, waiting for him to come back. But he didn't. Not that day, not the next. But I couldn't stop thinking about him and the strange, unsettling things he'd said. It was a week later that I saw him again, standing outside the bookstore late in the evening, his face hidden in the shadows. I was locking up for the night, and I froze when I saw him. This time, he wasn't just staring. He was watching me like a hawk, his eyes intent on every move I made. "Vincent," I called out, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" He stepped into the light, smiling his strange, cold smile. "I told you I'd show you, didn't I?" Before I could react, he lunged at me, grabbing me by the arm and pulling me toward the alley behind the store. Panic surged through me as I struggled, my heart pounding wildly. I managed to break free for a moment, but he was stronger than I had anticipated. "Don't fight it," he said softly, almost soothingly. "You'll see what's been hidden from you. You'll see the truth." I kicked and screamed, but he dragged me farther into the alley. I could hear my breath coming in ragged gasps, and then I saw something that made my stomach twist in terror. A figure standing at the far end of the alley. A man, tall and imposing, wearing a dark coat. Vincent paused, glancing at the figure before looking back at me. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. Everything's in place now." In a sudden burst of adrenaline, I pulled away from Vincent again, stumbling backward until I crashed into a dumpster. My mind was racing, trying to find a way out. I reached into my pocket, fumbling for my phone. I had to call the police. I couldn't let this go on any longer. But Vincent wasn't done. Before I could even unlock my phone, he lunged again, and this time I wasn't fast enough. He grabbed my arm with an iron grip, and I felt a sharp pain shoot through my shoulder as he twisted me around. "Let go of me," I screamed. "I'm sorry it had to come to this," he said softly. "But you'll understand soon. You'll understand everything." That was when I heard the sirens. I had no idea how far away they were, or if they were even coming for me. But it was enough. Vincent hesitated, and I used the moment to break free. I ran, faster than I'd ever run before, and kept running until I found a public street, where I finally flagged down a car and was able to get help. The police arrived just minutes later. By the time they reached the alley, Vincent and his accomplice were gone. But they didn't disappear for long. It turned out they had been running a small, twisted cult in the town, luring people in with promises of truth and knowledge. They'd been at it for years, picking people off one by one. The officers were able to arrest both men, and the town started to recover from the shock. But I couldn't shake the fear that it wasn't really over, that someone, somewhere, was still watching. I moved to Denver because I was looking for something different. I'd grown up in a small town where nothing ever really changed, and when the opportunity came to transfer to a branch of my company here, I jumped at it. I thought the hustle and bustle of the city would help me leave the past behind. At 29, I was done with the familiar, the comfortable, and the predictable. I wanted excitement, adventure, even if it meant taking on a challenge. I found an apartment in a renovated building in a neighborhood that was just starting to pick up speed. The walls were thin, the floors creaked, and the building had that old, charming feel. It wasn't glamorous, but it had character, and that was enough for me. Denver was alive, always moving, and there was something electric about the pace. My first week was mostly uneventful. I settled in, met a few neighbors, and spent a lot of time at work trying to catch up on everything. But there was one person who stood out, Arthur. He was one of the tenants in the building, and while he wasn't the friendliest guy I'd met, he was harmless enough. Mid-30s, a bit stocky, with thick, curly hair, and a penchant for wearing outdated sweaters. He worked odd hours. Sometimes I'd see him coming in at all hours of the night, but I never thought much of it. It started with small talk. I'd run into him in the hallway or on the stairs, and he'd smile awkwardly, making brief, friendly comments. I thought he was just a shy guy, maybe a little lonely. He always asked how I was settling in, offering to help me with anything I needed. At first, I politely declined. He seemed a little strange, but I didn't mind him. "You know, it's hard to find a place like this," he said one day, his voice more serious than usual as he leaned against the wall. "Most places in this neighborhood are overpriced. People don't realize how rare it is to get in here. You've got to appreciate it, you know?" I just nodded, unsure how to respond. I didn't understand what he meant by it, but he smiled, shrugged it off, and wandered back to his apartment. It seemed like a harmless comment, but something about his tone stuck with me, like he was trying to tell me something more. I pushed it out of my mind. A few days later, he knocked on my door. I had just come home from work and was about to grab something to eat when I heard the knock. When I opened it, he was standing there with a small box in his hands, his eyes bright with an energy that felt a little off. "Hey, I thought you might like this," he said, holding up the box. "It's a book, one I think you'll enjoy. It's kind of a rare find. I've read it a couple of times. Let me know what you think." He handed it to me without waiting for a response, then turned and started walking away before I could say anything. I stared at the book in my hands. It was an old hardcover with no title on the cover, the kind of thing you'd expect to find buried in the back of a dusty second-hand bookstore. My curiosity got the best of me, and I opened it later that night. The pages were yellowed, and the text, handwritten, looked like something from another time. As I read, the story became increasingly disturbing. Descriptions of people trapped in a decaying town, their lives gradually being overtaken by a shadowy presence. There were accounts of strange rituals, of whispers in the night, and of people disappearing without a trace, never to be found again. The deeper I got, the more unsettling it became, as if the book itself was warning me of something that was coming closer with each page I turned. It wasn't long after that Arthur started showing up at my door again. At first, it was just casual check-ins, always with some reason why he was knocking. "Hey, I noticed you were getting a lot of packages. Is everything okay?" Or, "Did you get that book I gave you?" It was harmless enough, and I began to see him as nothing more than an eccentric neighbor, maybe someone who had a little too much time on his hands. But then he started showing up at odd hours. He'd knock at 9 p.m., then again at 2 a.m., always asking if I needed help with something. His questions became less about me settling in and more about my routines, my comings and goings. At first, I thought maybe he was just lonely, or maybe he was trying to be helpful, but each time, his presence felt heavier, more invasive. I couldn't explain it, but I was starting to feel like I couldn't shake him off. One night, I came home from a late shift, and I saw him standing outside my door, waiting for me. His eyes were wide, his posture unnaturally still. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "Arthur, what's going on?" I asked, trying to sound calm, but failing to mask the growing sense of unease that was gnawing at me. "I'm just checking in," he said, his voice lower than usual. "I noticed you've been working late. I thought we could talk. Maybe you'd like some company. You've been so isolated lately." "I'm fine, Arthur. I really am. Thanks, but I just need some rest," I replied, trying to shut the door, but he placed his hand on it, holding it open with surprising strength. "You don't understand, do you?" he said, his voice soft but insistent. "You're in the right place. This is where you're meant to be. You don't have to leave." I pulled back, alarmed. "Arthur, what are you talking about?" His expression shifted, his lips curling into a tight smile. "Don't worry. I'll make sure you understand soon. You'll see." It was then that I noticed something was very wrong. His eyes weren't just fixated on me. He was looking past me, almost through me, as if something else was occupying his mind. I stepped back, heart pounding, and slammed the door shut, locking it as quickly as I could. The next day, things escalated. I had just finished a shift and was about to head to bed when I found a note slipped under my door. It was written in the same scrawling handwriting as the book Arthur had given me. It read, "You can't leave now. You're one of us. You'll understand soon." My stomach twisted. This was becoming something darker than I could have imagined. I started looking for ways to leave the apartment, but each time I thought about it, I felt a strange pressure on my chest, like I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was as if I was trapped in my own home. Arthur's visits became more frequent, and each time he'd stand just a little too close, his gaze intense, almost predatory. I tried to avoid him, but there was nowhere to go. It seemed like he was always just around the corner, lurking, waiting for me to make a mistake. I decided to confront him. The next time I saw him in the hallway, I didn't back down. "Arthur, I need you to leave me alone. I don't want anything to do with whatever you're involved in. This is getting out of hand." He smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was a tight, restrained smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "You can't leave. You belong here now. I've made sure of it. You'll come to understand." And that's when I realized the truth. It wasn't just about me being his neighbor. It was about something much darker, something he'd been plotting for a long time. He wasn't just a lonely guy. He was dangerous, obsessed, and I was stuck in his web. That night, when I heard scratching at my door, I knew it was over. I couldn't stay in the apartment anymore. I had to leave. I grabbed my things in a panic, rushing out into the night. But as I passed the hallway, I caught sight of him. Arthur was standing there, blocking the exit, his eyes wide, his face twisted with that same eerie smile. "You don't have to leave," he said, his voice low, almost soothing. "This is where you belong." I ran. I didn't look back. I barely made it to the street before I flagged down a car and fled the building. The next day, the apartment was empty. Arthur was gone, vanished. The landlord couldn't explain it. There were no signs of struggle, no clues to his whereabouts. But I knew he was still out there, still watching, waiting for me to return. I never went back. I moved to the outskirts of a small city in Oregon, a place where the trees seemed to go on forever, and the air always had a fresh, earthy smell. I was in my early 30s at the time, fresh off a divorce, hoping the change of scenery would give me a new sense of direction. The stress of the breakup had taken a toll on me, and I figured a quieter place would be the perfect setting to regroup, to escape the chaos, and try to figure out what was next. The house I rented was an old 2-story place on a quiet street, with a few neighbors scattered around. Most of them were older, lived in homes that had been passed down for generations, and didn't seem to pay much attention to the younger folks who moved in and out. The area was mostly forest, so the occasional jogger or dog walker would pass by, but the house felt isolated enough to give me the peace I was hoping for. It was cozy, with wooden beams and creaky floorboards, the kind of place that seemed to settle into its own rhythm after years of existence. But there was something about it, something that made me uneasy at first, though I couldn't put my finger on it. The first few weeks passed without incident. I started to get into a routine, working from home during the day and taking long walks in the woods when I needed to clear my mind. One morning, as I was leaving the house for a hike, I noticed a man standing across the street. He was leaning against a telephone pole, watching me with a curious gaze. His appearance wasn't threatening, but there was something unsettling about the way he lingered there, as though waiting for me to notice him. I hesitated, but decided to ignore it. I didn't have time to deal with any weirdness. I had enough on my plate. I walked past him, keeping my pace steady, but I felt his eyes on me. By the time I turned the corner, I was already trying to forget about him. Later that evening, he knocked on my door. "Hey, neighbor," he said when I opened it. He was in his late 40s, tall but lean, with a scruffy beard and hair that looked like it hadn't seen a comb in days. "I saw you earlier. Thought I'd introduce myself. Name's Roy. I live just up the street." I was surprised. I hadn't seen him before, but then again, the neighborhood wasn't exactly bustling. "I'm Sam," I said, feeling a bit awkward. "Just moved in." "Yeah, I figured," Roy replied, his eyes gleaming with an odd intensity. "This place is a bit of a hidden gem. A lot of people don't even realize it's here." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. He didn't seem dangerous, just a little eccentric maybe, but the way he kept staring made me uncomfortable. "I'll let you get back to it," he said, giving a strange half-smile. "Just thought I'd say hello. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." I closed the door, chalking it up to him just being friendly, maybe a little too forward. It was nothing, right? Over the next few days, Roy started popping up more frequently. He'd knock on my door at odd times, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the evening, always offering help with something. A loose fence panel, a stuck window, even just chatting about the neighborhood. It was getting to the point where I couldn't avoid him. The man had a way of finding me, even when I tried to stay out of sight. He'd wave from his porch when I was walking to the car, or catch me while I was out in the yard. But it was more than that. He had a way of remembering small details I hadn't shared. He'd mention things about my work, how long I'd been doing it, how the transition had been for me. He asked questions about my ex-wife, things I'd never told him. At first, I thought he was just being friendly, trying to make conversation, but after a while, it felt invasive. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was keeping tabs on me. One evening, after a particularly uncomfortable conversation about my job, I decided I'd had enough. I was sitting on the porch, enjoying a rare, quiet moment, when Roy appeared at the end of the driveway. "Hey, Sam," he said, his voice casual, but there was an edge to it now, something darker. "I've been thinking about you. You know, you're really in a perfect spot here. I mean, a guy like you could really make something of this place. The land, the area. It's all just waiting for someone to take advantage of it. And you're the perfect candidate." I looked up at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" Roy smiled, like a salesman closing in on a deal. "I've got an idea, a little project, you know. I've been doing this for a while. I've got a way to get you what you need, make this place work for you." I could feel my stomach drop, but I didn't want to show any weakness. "I'm not interested, Roy." He didn't take offense, but his smile faltered just for a second. No, you'll come around. Trust me." The conversation ended awkwardly, and I shut the door behind him, shaking my head. This wasn't normal. Roy had started off harmless enough, but now there was something unsettling about him, something I couldn't quite explain, but it was there, gnawing at me. The next day, Roy showed up again. This time, his demeanor was different. He didn't knock. He just stood there on the other side of the window, staring at me. He was still, focused, and didn't blink. His hands were clenched by his sides, his jaw tight. I could feel a cold sweat breaking out on my neck. I went to the front door and locked it. I decided it would be best if I just ignored him, so I went upstairs to do some chores for about 15 minutes. When I returned to the front door to see if Roy was still standing at the window, I saw something that truly horrified me. The front door was open, and there was Roy, standing in my living room, a smile on his face. "Sam," he said, his voice soft and calm, but there was no mistaking the menace in it. "I told you, you belong here. You just don't understand yet." I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. This wasn't the man who had introduced himself with small talk. This was someone else, someone dangerous, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out just how far he'd go. I bolted out the back door and ran into the woods, hearing Roy's footsteps behind me, following. He called my name in that eerie, sing-song voice, but I didn't look back. The trees were dense, the ground uneven, but I didn't care. I had to get away from him. Eventually, I lost him in the woods. I found my way back to the road and flagged down a car. I didn't look back when I got in, and I didn't stop until I was miles away from that house. I called the police, and when they arrived at the house, Roy was gone. just as quickly as he had appeared. No signs of a struggle, no trace of him anywhere. But I knew what had happened. I knew he had been watching me, planning it all. I never went back to that house. The landlord never got any answers about Roy. But I wasn't going to wait to find out what he had in mind next. That small town in Oregon would be something I would only visit in my nightmares from now on.